Now, as McCarthy turns to these presidential meetings, the debt clash, and the open questions about how he will lead within the new rules that created a different type of speakership, many say, that came out of the clash we just showed you. Well, tonight, our broadcast begins as we turn to the congressman at the center of so much of it, Matt Gaetz, Republican from Florida. Welcome. Thanks for being here.
Oh, it's good to be back. Been a few years.
Been a little while. So people have seen you there. We look at the new rules. First question, what do you think you or the Republican caucus are now achieving under these new rules?
These new rules will last long past my time in Congress or Kevin McCarthy's as Speaker, and they democratize the process so that individual members can offer amendments, can target spending for reductions. It was even Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that went on Alex Wagner's program during this balloting and said that a lot of the things that we were fighting for as conservative populists were supported by populists on the left because it didn't concentrate so much power in the hands of the Speaker and the leadership. I think that'll vindicate the service of all 435 members.
Let's take a look at some of the rules, as you mentioned. A single member instead of a larger group can force a kind of no confidence vote, longer time to read the bills, others up on the screen. Thus far, do you feel that McCarthy is following all of this? And do you expect there to be a potential no confidence vote in his tenure, or that's probably off the table now?
I don't expect it, though, of course. It is good for the health of the institution for any speaker to know that one member could call for a vote on their reign in power. I'm particularly pleased that Kevin McCarthy has been meeting his commitments on policy, on procedure, and on personnel. We've got a number of great conservatives now on the Rules Committee and on the Appropriations Committee that wouldn't have had that opportunity but for this temporary clash at the beginning of the year. I think we're a stronger team now going forward, and I think we've given Kevin McCarthy every reason to be the very best version of himself.
Interesting. I think viewers and listeners will notice you sound a little different now than during the clash, although everyone's allowed to evolve within the caucus.
Kevin evolved.
Well,
right? I mean, I'm allowed to change my opinion when he changes.
Sure. Let me read you what he evolved, and his allies say that it wasn't even you at the end pushing. And I want to give you a chance to respond to that. Take Congressman McHenry, who said that basically by the end, you were not requesting or receiving items beyond what McCarthy handed over. And we have this quote, I think, that you were showing you could just halt things, quote, for no reason. Was there anything specific you were asking for in that dramatic end period that we all witnessed?
Yeah, what was at issue in the 14th and 15th vote was the one-person motion to vacate, because just moments before the 14th ballot, a more moderate Republican, Tony Gonzalez, tweeted out that he was going to vote against the rules package that ensconced this one-member motion to vacate, a key accountability tool. I was worried that Tony Gonzalez wasn't the only person who felt that way, and in fact, his tweet could have led to a moderate jailbreak on the rules, where we could have elected McCarthy and then been absent the enforcement tool if he did not keep his commitment. And so what we secured during the 14th and 15th ballot was an absolute ironclad commitment that Tony Gonzalez would be alone in opposing the rules package, and that we would, in fact, ice in and really put into cement the changes to the House of Representatives that we think will make it a better House for every Republican, every Democrat, and every American.
So just to be clear, when McHenry and others say that, your response is what? They're misinformed, or they're lying about you?
Well, just go look at Twitter. Tony Gonzalez said he wasn't going to vote for the rules, and so I required those assurances. If you ask Patrick McHenry what was being discussed in those tense moments you just showed, I was pointing over at where Tony Gonzalez sat to say, hey, McCarthy, you got to let me know that he's alone here and that there aren't 5, 10, 15 moderates who are going to scuttle this beautiful deal that we've put together. McCarthy gave me that assurance, and now I think we're a very strong team looking forward to the legislative work ahead.
Interesting. So we'll show the footage. Make sure we understand that we're talking about the same thing, because it was that floor footage that we saw. I think this is you guys talking there. So that was the entirety of your exchange, was about what you just told us?
Yeah, that was the principal. I mean, I don't have a transcript for you, but what was at issue then was whether or not Tony Gonzalez represented just himself or a larger group of moderates who would secure the speakership for McCarthy, but then not put into place the rules that would allow the one-person motion to vacate. So that's what the New York Times story gets wrong. They get a lot of things wrong, but that's the principal thing they get wrong. We weren't there for the sake of theater. We were there for the sake of ensuring that the rules we'd so heavily negotiated. And I got to give a lot of credit to my colleagues Chip Roy, Dan Bishop, Scott Perry, many others who really put the meat on the bone regarding the specific commitments we were extracting from McCarthy at that time.
And just to button this up, then what was then Representative McCarthy saying to you in this exchange?
He was assuring me breathlessly that the rules would pass.
Got it. So that's a long ways. You mentioned evolving. Here's how you sounded about then candidate Representative McCarthy.
He's a desperate guy whose vote share is dropping with every subsequent vote, and I'm ready to vote all night, all week, all month, and never for that person.
And so one must wonder, Madam Clerk, is this an exercise in vanity? Maybe the right person for the job of Speaker of the House isn't someone who wants it so bad. Maybe the right person for the job of Speaker of the House isn't someone who has sold shares of themselves for more than a decade to get it.
Is he still not the right person in your view?
Well, he wasn't my first choice, but this is politics. We don't pitch underhand. At the end of the day, I ran out of stuff to ask for, Ari, and after we got the concessions on policy, on personnel, and on procedure, I didn't vote for McCarthy, but we did allow him to assume the speakership with less than 218 votes. That's how Nancy Pelosi got there. He's our speaker now. Long live the speaker.
Yeah. So you mentioned personnel. That is something that has been reportedly written down and agreed to on the side, a sort of a side deal. Here's Congresswoman Mace on some of that.
We don't know what they got or didn't get. We haven't seen it. We don't have any idea what promises were made or what gentlemen's handshakes were made.
Let's get into this. Maybe we resolve it once and for all right here on live TV. You have a 55-page rules package. That part is public under the rules. We could put up reporting on that. We all know about that. Then you have reporting of a secret 3-page agreement. Reading here from Punchbowl, McCarthy and his allies hashed this out with the Freedom Caucus. It's got the other concessions, including Rules Committee. That's personnel, I believe, what you just referred to, and other things. Point blank, Congressman, have you or your staff seen this additional agreement in writing in any form?
Yeah, it took multiple forms. There was specifically a side-by-side sheet where we made offers to McCarthy. There were some offers he accepted, some he modified, some he rejected, just like you'd see in any negotiation. I could tell you that Thomas Massie, Chip Roy, Ralph Norman being on the Rules Committee would not have happened but for this negotiation. Folks like Representative Clyde, Representative Cloud, two great conservatives on the Appropriations Committee. That's a direct result of these negotiations. And this week we'll be voting on Paul Gosar's legislation to end the COVID national emergency. That was a piece of policy that McCarthy committed to bring to the floor.
I'll let you continue, but the question where I'm going is, why keep that secret?
What are your questions? I'm happy to tell you any element. I'm actually quite proud of the work product, so it's no secret at all.
The product, though, I appreciate you here taking questions, but why not release the written product that exists and has currently been kept secret? And for context, you and others have talked about bringing transparency to government. It's one thing to hear it described, and another thing for the government, now the House Republican majority, to just release whatever this underlying material is. Here's a little bit of how you and some others have sounded about government secrecy.
The American people are tired of the swamp games.
We had the audacity to want to know what in the world was going on behind closed doors.
Why not commit to releasing the written agreement or working to get it released tonight?
Yeah, I have no objection to that, but it was largely released to the conference and to the country when you saw the appointments of the committees. I mean, when you see now which members populate the key committees, you are in essence observing that agreement. When you see the schedule for floor votes on Dr. Gosar's legislation, you see that agreement. I can tell you we also have a commitment to have a vote on term limits, something that's popular in every zip code in America except Washington, D.C. We have a commitment for a budget resolution to roll back to 2022 spending levels. We, secured those things. I think they're critically important.
But Congressman Gaetz, let me follow up on this, and respectfully so. What it sounds like you're saying is some of the ingredients of this are you're saying coming out, and everyone, the public, the voters, your constituents in Florida should take your or the government's word for it. And that's really different than releasing a dated piece of material that explains what are the four corners of what your colleague, Congresswoman Mace, and others have called a secret agreement. In other words, I take your point. By the way, fact check true. Term limits are really popular for a lot of reasons. A lot of concerns, left, right, center, about people who stay in office forever. But again, why not have, and you guys were driving this, why not have you and your colleagues who negotiated it just release what was agreed to at the time in writing?
Again, I have no objection to that. I don't know that I still have a copy because we were able to resolve a lot of these things with committee appointments, with the floor schedule on the votes, and with the passage of the rules package. Remember, that was the thing that McCarthy originally said was his red line. He said he would never go to a one-member motion to vacate. He said that to me directly. But to his great credit, he ultimately agreed to that.
The thing you say you're proud of and that you won, you just didn't keep a copy of?
I know it, Ari. I'm here telling it to you. It's the release of the January 6th footage, the 14,000 hours. It's the legislation we've discussed. There's no grave secret. There's no big reveal coming later. You can see in the people, in the rules that we've passed, and in the bills that we've scheduled for votes that this is our Republican plan, and I'm really proud of it.
I wanted to get your answers on all that, and it's all, I think, very interesting, and you may have made some news saying you're open to it coming out. Maybe someone who does have a copy will release it. You can imagine anyone in government, whether it's someone at the SEC or FBI or in a different party, if they said, take my word for it, we don't need to release it, you might say no, then Speaker Pelosi.
By the way, that's what the FBI tells us all the time when we ask questions on the Judiciary Committee. I don't.
The question is, do you sound like
they
the
don't
FBI
describe it for us? Well, no, the difference is I'm describing to you all of the elements and features of the deal.
You are describing your version of it, and I appreciate that. That's why we're having a colloquy, as they say, in your branch of government.
I guess if you prefer someone else's version, you should invite them. I'm telling you my version.
We want the evidence. You also said on the record you didn't keep the copy. Okay. I want to turn to something else really interesting that came up, and you mentioned January 6th in the committee. There was this meeting at the White House on December 21st where you discussed Jan 6 strategy, whether Pence would take some sort of unconstitutional action. Reporting said it lasted several hours. What did you advocate in that meeting at the White House in December 21?
Nothing. I was seeking to understand the process because this was unprecedented. We expected that Senator Hawley would be joining House objectors, and we didn't know whether that would result in one unicameral debate, if the Senate and the House would retire to their respective chambers to debate, who would preside over those various debates, how people would be recognized. So it was a very friendly meeting. Vice President Pence was there. Vice President Pence, in fact, encouraged the debate. He said the debate was something that needed to happen, and he laid out his plans to entertain that. Unfortunately, violence and riots really obstructed the work that we wanted to do to have a substantive debate on election integrity.
Did you hear anything in that meeting that you considered unconstitutional or illegal?
No.
Okay. Then why, after that meeting, did you seek a pardon for yourself and others who attended that meeting?
That's been misreported. What I've suggested is that there were various groups of people that President Trump was considering pardoning for a variety of reasons. And I was very involved in a number of pardon negotiations. Some of those were granted, like the Blackwater Four. Some, went a different direction, like Joe Exotic. But in that particular discussion, there was nothing that emerged where anyone sought a pardon. I will say we see a Department of Justice that seems to be pretty weaponized against
we can do both,
people.
But just to be clear, you're denying that you sought a pardon for yourself?
Yes, that's correct.
Here's some of the under oath testimony from Trump insiders, and I know you've maintained a strong relationship with Donald Trump. But basically, we've got multiple people, the director of White House presidential personnel, who's a Trump loyalist, lawyer Eric Hirschman, Cassie Hutchinson famously. We could put this up. They all testified under oath that you specifically requested a pardon. And I'll play a little bit of the sound on this. Here was the lawyer out of these three discussing it in testimony. Take a listen.
The general tone was we may get prosecuted because we were defensive of, the president's positions on these things. As broad as you could describe. From the beginning, I remember he's from the beginning of time up until today for any and all things. You mentioned Nixon, and I said Nixon's pardon was never nearly that broad.
That's some of the testimony. To give you the benefit of responding, since I have you here tonight, here's what some others said in the hearing, MTG discussing just generally that meeting, and then others describing that. Take a listen.
Said we've got to have a meeting. There's many of us that feel like this election has been stolen.
On December 21st, some Republican members of Congress met with President Trump in the White House to talk about overturning the 2020 election.
Mr. Gaetz was personally pushing for a pardon, and he was doing so since early December, advocated for there to be a blanket pardon for members involved in that meeting.
I want to give you the benefit of responding to it, but I also want to take this process seriously. So respectfully, you have individuals who are not known to be coordinating in any way. They all have their own counsel. They have an incredible legal liability if they lied about this. And multiple individuals, all of whom, by the way, Republican appointees, are testifying that in that period after that December meeting, you, sir, requested a pardon for yourself and other attendees at the meeting. And so the question is, can you really say that all of them are committing perjury, lying on you, A, and B, if a pardon was requested, why not just tell us what were you worried about? What was it that you thought you or others might be indicted for?
Well, I mean, Cassidy Hutchinson is a known liar. There's testimony she's given that directly results in perjury. So I would certainly take exception with her testimony. I do not remember it the same way Eric Hirschman does. I did have conversations with Eric Hirschman about different groups of people that could potentially receive pardons, even including some of the people who may have committed a technical violation of federal law, but that weren't engaged in violence on January 6th. So
I
guessed hold on now.
Mr. McAtee, no, I'm going to let you finish, but is Mr. McAtee a liar as well? And yes, you may finish.
Well, I had a lot of conversations with Mr. McAtee about pardons for other folks and different groups of people. Whether or not some lawmakers would have fallen within those groups, I think, could be debated and discussed. But when it comes to, was I asking something specifically for me and only me under those circumstances, the answer would be no.
Did you advocate a pardon for other lawmakers to Mr. McAtee or others?
No, there were discussions about pardons for President Trump, his family members, his allies, and presumably members of Congress could have fallen in that group. But there was nothing in the January 21st meeting that would have resulted in any need for a pardon because we had Mike Pence there. He was present for the meeting. He was friendly and I think very accommodating to our request to just know information about how the floor would play out that day. Most of the floor action in Congress is very scripted. This was going to be unprecedented, and we wanted to make sure we understood how he intended to proceed from a procedural posture.
Vice President Pence's attendance doesn't cancel out if somebody tried to plan or conspire or attempt a crime any more than Donald Trump is under investigation in Georgia for calling an elections official, and the allegation is potentially that he was conspiring and that person was resisting. I mean, if Pence was
right,
resisting,
but Mike Pence wrote a book about all the things that he objected to that were a pressure campaign against him, and this January 21st meeting does not make an appearance in that book. And so I think it shows you that Pence did not view this as some sort of criminal pressure or some sort of attempt to view things differently. We obviously now know, with the benefit of time, that Mike Pence took a different view than some of the people who attended that meeting. And if that was some source of criminal behavior, I think you'd be hearing from the vice president that that was the case. But of course, it was more about process, and that's why it wouldn't ever have been the subject of a pardon request from anyone.
The process, though, was still trying to overturn the lawful election of President-elect Biden. After the courts have been exhausted and after, of course, the Electoral College had voted, you and others, of course, then voted not to certify. I'm curious for us to understand this, as you are sort of charting this period, as you say you have influence in the caucus and you say you're going to try to work with Kevin McCarthy and everything else. I'm curious, what's your basic bottom line position on what happened on January 6th? Those folks who stormed the Capitol at least shared the goal that you identified, which was to overturn the election results. When they stormed the Capitol, did you view that as well? You welcome them because you guys share the same goal, or how did you view it?
No, of course not. Our goal was to have a debate and a discussion. And it's really interesting when your network talks about this, you never seem to reflect on the fact that Jamie Raskin and Jim McGovern and Benny Thompson, all Democrats, were offering their objections to Trump electors. Matter of fact, the last Republican president to be sworn in absent some sort of Democrat objection to their electors was George Herbert Walker Bush. And so this is not some, circumstance where we were trying to overturn an election. We wanted to have a debate about election integrity. Vice President Pence agreed that debate would be helpful, and we were there on the 21st to discuss how the debate would go.
When they stormed the Capitol, your view was what of them?
My view is that was a terrible day, and I completely oppose political violence. I love politics, but I'm not much for violence. So if this thing becomes violent, I'm not going to be very good at it for very long. So I have no love for anyone who would strike another, harm another for the sake of politics like that.
So, Congressman, let's take what you just said seriously. You referred to the coverage of this, the network, and you referred to what we might call the legislative history or the precedent where there have been, as you accurately note, there have been certifications challenged before. But you voted to do that after you and others were run out of your place of work because of the Trump fans that Donald Trump summoned to Washington. We know how they got there. We know what they did in the morning. We know that Mr. Eastman and others wanted them to be a part of the pressure campaign to overturn the election. And so while you mention history, none of those other votes, of course, took place after a violent insurrection. And so let me ask this the clearest way possible. And again, I appreciate you coming on and taking the questions. But if you're going to take them honestly, sir, do you not see how doing that after those people came in with the Trump flags, attacking police, where's Nancy, where's Pence, the person you met with, Vice President Pence, was targeted for assassination by those people. Members of your caucus and the other party, who cares what party, targeted, run out of this place. And you had to come back under the threat of violence and try to hold that. That voting then in common cause with them against certification, do you not see how people of good faith, including Republicans, if you want to be political about it, view that as different and a tacit support for part of what they did that day, that it's different since you did it right after the violence?
No, I would reject that premise. I am in no common cause with people who engage in political violence. I am against it explicitly and have been consistent on that point. I think what would have been really unfortunate for my constituents and a betrayal of my constituents is if I would have let a violent act or a riot change the vote that was an informed vote based on some of the concerns that I had about the election. So, again, we didn't do anything different than Democrats had done, not only once, but literally for every Republican since George H.W. Bush. Well, I mean, they were objecting to George W. Bush's win over John Kerry. Well, they were objecting to. I wasn't going to change my vote.
Obviously, sir, you're going to conduct yourself however you choose. I acknowledge some of the things you said that are rooted in history. I don't know if you can acknowledge what I just said, which is that it was different than those examples because you just had a actual, now convicted sedition insurrection. That's the difference.
Well, I don't think that my vote should have changed because of violence. I think when we start changing our votes based on violent acts,
that's not what
you're
I'm
actually going to invite more violent acts.
But that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that what were usually small and somewhat ceremonial or what we call message votes in Congress sometimes looked very different that night. And I guess you're saying you don't even see or understand why it could look different.
I don't see why my concerns about election integrity and perhaps the ceremonial position I wanted to take regarding changes to election law, I didn't understand why that should be frustrated or diminished because some people really took some very unfortunate steps to engage in violence and a riot on the Capitol, something that I summarily reject.
All right. Well, look, I appreciate you taking the questions on that. We've gone long on a lot of issues, including some policy. I did want to get you on the record because first time you've been back on the beat on a story we've covered. The Washington Post reporting the career prosecutors ultimately recommended no charges in this case that involved an associate or former associate of yours and what was a sex trafficking probe. How do you view this case? Is it closed? And have you heard anything from the DOJ about it?
Well, 4 months ago, you did your last story on this in the beat, and you said that my denials had been substantiated. That was your word after that Washington Post report, so I guess I don't quibble at all with your characterization.
Yeah, we did report that because, as you say, that's what was coming out of the probe. Beyond the criminal line, I did also want to ask you about some of the allegations, and not suggesting we rehash everything. And as reported, the DOJ seems to be signaling no charges. If you have a comment on whether you heard from them, we'd be very interested on that. And then second, with regard to Mr. Greenberg, many outlets have reported things that range from his now convicted crimes to corruption, to you going to a tax office late at night, to you Venmoing him money, to there being alleged events or group activities where at least others, and again, I want to be very precise, not reporting about confirming this regard to you, but others at those events accused of crimes in those settings. Do you regret any of that? Do you think there's anything here to change or learn from, even if it doesn't reach a criminal bar as reported?
Well, a lot of the things you mentioned as to me are not true. And of course, again, I've made those denials consistently. You even indicated that those denials have been substantiated. Do I regret any association with Mr. Greenberg? Absolutely. And I had to be candid with my constituents that it would be fair for them in this last election to judge me based on that association. But I hope they would judge it alongside all the other work that I've done for them. And they reelected me with overwhelming vote shares, about 70% of the vote in the general election. So I do regret that. It's an association I shouldn't have had, and I am going to be a lot more careful about my associations going forward.
Understood. Congressman Matt Gaetz, we set aside the time because it's been a little while. You've obviously been in the news and in government here making waves. I appreciate you coming on the beat. I hope you come back.
Absolutely. Hope you'll have me. I look forward to seeing you in Washington soon, I hope.
Yes, sir. Congressman Matt Gaetz, thank you.